From the time of Augustine forward, we have demythologized, we have stripped away, we have denied that the events of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 are supernatural. We explain away the sons of God episode with the daughters of men. That wasn't the case, for centuries, since it was written on through the intertestamental period. There's an individual, Julius Africanus, who prior to Augustine was the first one to sort of reject the supernatural worldview, but then Augustine did, and there are reasons why he did. He had an axe to grind, I think, with some of the material in Judaism and in the Manichees, which was the Christian sect that he joined after his conversion, that revered the Book of Enoch, and the Book of Enoch made a big deal out of this episode. And so when they had that parting of the ways, Augustine is just not mindful of the need for the passage and frankly just doesn't want to hear anything about it. And so the rest of the church, because of his stature, essentially follows suit. And so ever since we've had views of Genesis 6 that make the supernatural context of it go away. So we miss number 2. And number 3 is we know all about the story of Babel, but we never really find Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. Because prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls, it would read that the nations were divided up according to the number of the sons of Israel. And the few people that asked, well, how does that make sense because there was no Israel, don't really have an answer. And so it tends to be largely ignored until we realize, again, through the Dead Sea Scrolls, that it really says sons of God there, and that takes us into this divine, something going on here.
And something that I had messaged you about, just because as I was reading your book, I'm reading Matthew Bates' book before, there was just this I guess pull and tug on me to really want to focus on just the foundational principles of understanding, the basic questions of what is the Bible, what story is the Bible telling, who is Jesus, how do we define gospel, and we're going to get into all that because I think that's important, and we're going to kind of use the lens of your book to really just explore what is the Bible and what narrative, what story is it telling. So in your book, you describe the modern travesty of evangelical churches detaching itself from the Old Testament and the Hebrew Scriptures, with data suggesting that 40% of Christians question the necessity of the Old Testament. Andy Stanley is famous for saying that we need to unhitch from the Old Testament. We think this is a travesty here, and so do you. I love how you point that this is not just a modern problem, but stems back to the very infancy of our church, with the likes of Marcion trying to completely remove the Hebrew narrative. So I wanted to just here at Ring Them Bells, we have a saying, I don't know if you've heard me say it before, we say the beginning is near. And it's designed to help us be reminded that no matter where we are in Scripture, whether Old or New Testament, we find ourselves rooted in the narrative that starts in Genesis. So your book echoes this when you say, if the gospel narrative stems from the Old Testament, indeed from Genesis, it seems to develop it as a comprehensive narrative throughout Scripture, potentially from beginning to end. What we have in the contemporary church is functionally Marcionism. Rarely will a mainstream evangelical Christian reject the Old Testament outright. However, many just simply ignore it, and others reduce it to moral principles or fun stories. We almost exclusively preach and develop theology from the New Testament. You say, in this book, you practice and call for a gospel rooted in the Old Testament theology and narrative. Anthony, I love that, and I love how you put that we have in the contemporary church functional Marcionism. That was just I'm going to steal that and use it all the time. Help us understand what you mean there, and for us to see the importance of connecting Jesus to that Hebrew narrative.
Yeah, so I'm sure you obviously understand this, but just to make clear what I mean by functional Marcionism, when you attach the word functional to a term like that, what you're saying is that you're practicing something even if you don't believe it. And this is a problem. This is a problem with a number of things in the contemporary church, but Marcionism being, Marcion, who literally rejects the Old Testament on the grounds that he believes that the Old Testament God is this evil God, and the New Testament God is Jesus, who's this loving and compassionate God. And so he literally unhitches the Old Testament from the New because and by the way, rejected a large part of what today we would call the New Testament also,
Yep.
because frankly, the New Testament is all based on the Old Testament. So, he just cuts out whatever he doesn't like, and so that he can just talk about mercy and grace and the goodness of God all the time, and uh, you know, sound like anybody we know. We've got lots of Joel Osteen types of preachers out there today who it's just about, like I heard him say one time that like he wants to be known. It's not that he doesn't believe there's any bad stuff, but he wants to be known for all the good stuff. And I'm like, yeah, everybody does. Get over it. Read the Bible. It's like, and that's the problem with Marcionism is if you buy into this idea that the Old Testament is about wrath and judgment and all that, and the New Testament doesn't engage the wrath and judgment narrative at all, or that there's no grace and mercy and compassion in the Old Testament, you've completely missed the mark on what the Bible is teaching. And so you get rid of the Old Testament, frankly, you have no need of redemption in the New Testament.
Mm.
You might as well just go live your life however you want, because it's all about grace and mercy anyway. It's all about the good stuff anyway. And so functional Marcionism, we see it in churches in a number of different ways. But yeah, you mentioned it when you read the quote. But I do see a lot of this development of theology exclusively from the New Testament. Or the other thing I also see, and I think we're going to talk about this later, but like on the topic of God's wrath, for instance, you might develop a theology of God's wrath out of like Romans 4 and then read that into the Old Testament, which I think there's a place for saying we have New Testament revelation that teaches something very clearly, and then going to observe that in the Old Testament. If we wouldn't see Jesus in Genesis 3 if we didn't do that. And so like there's certain things that we want to there's times where that's appropriate. But also, if you've already developed your entire system and you're just going to the Old Testament to proof text, that's kind of a problem. And so it does need handled delicately. But when we're just doing our theology based on the New Testament, we come out with a lot of very rigid doctrines that, frankly, are what produced the, I don't know, evangelical light, the evangelical culture that it seems like we both kind of grew up in, where it's like, faith gets defined by, believe real hard. I don't know if you've ever heard somebody say, well, you didn't believe hard enough. And I'm like, what are you talking about? That's not English. Like, that doesn't mean anything in English, And so, yeah, like we needed to hear more. And that more is in the Old Testament story.
Mhm.
And we just want to live in like Paul's letters, and it's just unfortunate. And so we need to live in the grand narrative of Scripture, and at least get out of Paul's letters and into the Gospels. I mean, at least do that. But that's what functional Marcionism is to me, is about not reading this, to use the Bible Project, not reading the Bible as a unified whole, or as a story that begins in Genesis but points to Jesus from any point.
Yeah. Well, I agree with all that, and I'm glad that you brought it up at the beginning because it's important to see. And when we look at Marcionism, and then even with what we see today, and then even with what I see with Augustine, is that it wasn't just this like removal of like what you say, like we all call it the Old Testament. Everybody calls the Old Testament. That's actually kind of, in my opinion, a wrong term to use, but it's what we call it, Old Testament. But really, it's the Hebrew Scriptures. And what happened with Marcionism, and what I see with Augustine, and what I see with so much of this problem with unhitching from the Old Testament, like you said, or unhitching from the Hebrew Scriptures, is we're really just unhitching from the Hebrew narrative. And we're unhitching from all the weird stuff, all the stuff that doesn't fit our modern Greco-Roman world. And I mean, that's what it is. When you see Augustine, when you see Marcionism, these are at the infancy of the church, when the church was going through this cataclysmic change from being a part of this small Bedouin tribe in Jerusalem to expanding out into this Greco-Roman world, and all these things that were happening. And like with Augustine, we'll probably get into this when he influenced the church to not see the supernatural side of Genesis 6 and pushed away the influence and context of Enoch. to the point that, like, when you get to the church fathers, only 3 church fathers knew Hebrew, right? And you know, I'm not hating on them, because that was the point and place that everyone was with the scriptures as we were growing. But it's important to see that there was this whitewashing and removal of the Hebrew narrative and the Jewishness of the text almost immediately at the infancy of the church. I don't know if you agree with any of that.
No, I do agree with it. Part of that is that most of the church fathers are not actually Jewish. So, you know, what we get the New Testament is extremely Jewish, because they're almost all of the writers are Jews. And so we do see the Hebrew narrative saturated in the New Testament. But no, I completely agree with you. I actually think that there are places where I love to read the church fathers. And I think that it's difficult to understand Christian theology without reading the church fathers. I think that we need to see the way it progresses, but also I can't say that the church fathers are infallible, um, or even try to put them up next to Scripture, because they disagree not with each other, but they frequently get the narrative wrong. They change the narrative.
Yeah.
And there's grounds for doing that, to contextualize. I think Jesus does that to Psalm 82 and John 10. I think Jesus does that. He contextualizes to a Roman world a little bit to help them understand a principle. So there's times to do that in a moment, but I don't. But yeah, when it comes to like understanding this Hebrew, like the narrative of Scripture, I don't know how helpful the fathers always are on that point.
I agree with you. And it's not throwing them in the trash can, but it's making sure we keep that grain of salt pretty close to us as we understand it. We need your help. Ring Them Bells is a nonprofit organization where every dollar donated goes right back into the mission of spreading the good news and helping those in need. The main ministry of Ring Them Bells is serving those in need in the name of our King Jesus. Over the past year, we have fed over 2,000 meals, and next year, we want to double that. We can't do this without your support. Everything we create here and all of the food that we serve is free, because it's paid for by generous viewers just like you. If you feel led to donate and join the mission with us here at Ring Them Bells, click the Give Butter link in the notes and comments of this video. If you can't support us financially, please continue to like and share the content, as this helps us so much with spreading the good news about what Jesus has done for our world.